The Transportation Policy Committee is called to order. Melissa, will you take the roll?
Yes, Madam Chair, I'll call your name. Please indicate if you're present. Be sure to unmute yourself before responding. Mayor Anderson.
Here.
Thank you. Rock Arnett. Mayor Barney. Mayor Barney, are you there? Dave Barry. Councilmember Binsbacher.
Present.
Thank you. Jen Daniels.
Here.
Thank you. Doug DeClusen. Mayor Giles. Mayor Hall. Mayor Hall. Mayor Hartke.
Present.
Thank you. Charles Humental. Councilmember Clapp.
Here.
Thank you. Cheryl Lombard.
Here.
Thank you. Mayor Lord.
Present.
Thank you. Mayor Meck. Mayor Price. Mark Reardon.
Here.
Thank you. Supervisor Sellers.
Here.
Thank you. Mayor Wires.
I'm here.
Thank you. Mayor Weiss.
Here.
Thank you. And I believe we saw that Mayor Barney is here as well. Mayor Barney?
Yes, I am here. We're just
Thank
trying to
you.
unmute my mute.
Okay.
This
And
is Mayor Hall. Did you register me?
I did not. Thank you, Mayor Hall. And our
Okay.
chair is present, so we do have a quorum.
Melissa, Mayor
Is
Giles.
also present.
Yeah,
Thank
I was
you.
going to say Mayor Giles is on too.
Thank you, Mayor Giles.
Jackie Mack.
Okay, we got it. A quorum is present.
The next item is the call to the audience. Members of the public were asked to submit written comments related to this meeting through the MAG website. Comments may be sent at any time leading up to the meeting, but must be received at least 1 hour prior to the posted start time for the meeting. This is the opportunity for the public to comment on items that fall under MAG's jurisdiction that are not on the agenda or that are on the agenda for discussion and not for action. MAG staff, have we received any public comments?
Madam Chair, we've received no comments for this item or any other item on the agenda.
Thank you. The next item is approval of the consent agenda. Items 3A and 3B are on the consent agenda. Does any member of the TPC have questions or would like a presentation on any of these items? Could I have a motion to recommend approval of the consent agenda?
Mayor Hartke, so move.
I'll second it. This is Mayor Wires.
Any discussion of the motion? Melissa, can you call the roll?
Yes, I will call your name. Please indicate how you vote. Be sure to unmute your phone before responding or yourself. Mayor Anderson.
Aye.
Thank you. Rock Arnett. Mayor Barney.
Aye.
Thank you. Dave Barry. Councilmember Binsbacher.
Aye.
Thank you. Jen Daniels.
Aye.
Thank you. Doug DeClusen. Mayor Giles.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Hall.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Hartke.
Aye.
Thank you. Charles Humental. Councilmember Clapp.
Aye.
Thank you. Cheryl Lombard.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Lord.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Meck.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Price. Mark Reardon.
Aye.
Thank you. Supervisor Sellers.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Wires.
I vote aye.
Thank you. Mayor Weiss.
Aye.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, how do you vote?
Aye.
Thank you. Is there anyone that I missed? That carries unanimously.
Thank you. Nice job. Item 4 is the draft MAG policy principles. MAG's Nathan Pryor will give this report.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Transportation Policy Committee. Next slide, please. Today, we're bringing for action for recommended approval the most recent iteration of the MAG policy principles. Here you can see it's represented in a trifold brochure format. Next slide, please. We find this format handy as a leave behind when we meet with members of the state legislature, congressional officials, or even at our public meetings. So the MAG policy principles ranges broadly from our roles of responsibility as an agency, but also more specific legislative issues as well. We've been bringing forward the MAG policy principles for a number of years now. This is handy not only as a leave behind, if you will, but something that we can draw upon during the course of a given year or so in terms of stated policy principles. When issues do arise, we're able to respond more quickly rather than having to keep bringing these issues back for reaffirmation, if you will. Of note, in this year's iteration of the MAG policy principles, next slide, please, is a statement regarding enabling legislation for extension of the half-cent sales tax for transportation. Last month, we did bring this through on consent agendas to Management Committee, TPC, and Regional Council. The Executive Committee also did hear this item last month. This month, we have brought it so far to the Economic Development Committee, the Management Committee. They have both recommended approval. Of note on this enabling legislation piece, during last month when we had our draft on the consent agenda, we had a different version of this statement, and there were some concerns brought to light regarding when we are in a 2021 legislative session, that perhaps it looked like we were ready to move forward with enabling legislation, actively pursuing that during the session. We did work with the staff from Maricopa County, government relations staff, in redrafting the statement, as we appreciate their help and effort on this. So this more accurately captures the fact that we are in our process, our planning process, and we will continue to be in this process during the spring months of 2021. So better capturing kind of the state of planning that we're in, that process that we're in, and then of course we will be pursuing enabling legislation for extension of the half-cent sales tax when the time is ready. Next slide, please. In addition to the policy principles, we've added a statement about prohibition of discrimination in the planning and delivery of our programs. We thought that this was important to bring forward, especially at this time. Next slide, please. Madam Chair, again, this item is on for action for recommended approval. Upon recommended approval, we'll move forward to bring this to MAG Regional Council next week. That concludes my presentation. I'm available for any questions.
Any questions for Nathan?
Madam Chair, this is Mayor Wires.
Go ahead, Mayor Wires.
Yeah, not so much a question, but I do want to thank Meg. That first graph that they showed about the 18 cents per gallon of gas. I'm really glad that they did that, because I think that a graph like that shows people, makes people understand where we're at and what we're facing. The fact that even though we may have as much money as 20 years ago, the fact is that money only goes half as far, and a lot more miles being driven on the freeways, a lot more wear and tear. And so I think it's important that people understand, how important it is that, we have to address the problems that we have. And I'm always concerned that when we talk about continuation of the half-cent sales tax, the fact that we haven't actually made a decision that we're going to continue a half-cent or 3/4 or 1 cent. So I guess not so much for Nathan, but for everybody, maybe we need to just figure out a way that we quit saying a continuation, but I don't know, address it in a different way that doesn't make it sound like we're only going for that half-cent. I think that that's detrimental to our cause. But I do like the graph. I like the way they've done it. So I just wanted to thank them for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
This
Much
is Mayor
appreciated.
Laura.
Any other?
Yes, I'd like to just support him. You know, when you think about advertising and you're getting public information, the number sticks with them. And so then later we negotiate and try to decide together that we're going to go up 0.5% or what. Then the people already have all the information with that number in mind. So Jerry, I thought that was a really valid situation when you're presenting something that you're selling. Essentially, that's what we're doing. So good idea. Thank you.
Mayor Wires, did you want to respond to that?
I agree with everything she said.
Wonderful. I thought I saw you wave, but maybe it was a affirmation of what she said. Excellent. If there are no additional questions, could we have a motion to recommend approval of the draft MAG policy principles?
I'll be more than happy to make that motion.
Second, this is Mayor Anderson.
Motion from Mayor Wires and a second from Mayor Anderson. Any discussion of the motion? Melissa, can you take us through roll call?
Yes, I will call your name. Please indicate how you vote. Be sure to unmute before responding. Mayor Anderson.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Barney.
Aye.
Thank you. Councilmember Binsbacher.
Aye.
Thank you, Councilmember Binsbacher. Jen Daniels.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Giles.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Hall.
Aye.
Mayor Hart. Thank you, Mayor Hall. Mayor Hartkey.
Yes.
Thank you. Councilmember Clapp.
Aye.
Thank you. Cheryl Lombard.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Lord. Mayor Lord.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Meck.
Aye.
Thank you. Mark Reardon.
Aye.
Thank you. Supervisor Sellers.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Wires.
I vote aye.
Thank you. Mayor Weiss.
Aye.
Thank you. Mayor Woods. And Chair Gallego, how do you vote?
I vote aye.
Thank you. Is there anyone that I missed? That does carry unanimously.
Item 5 is an update on the development of a new regional transportation plan. MAG staff Audra Kester Thomas will provide a report.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, members of Transportation Policy Committee. Good to be back with you today to provide the latest update in the development of the Regional Transportation Plan. The previous agenda item certainly doesn't go unnoticed on the important questions that certainly still lie ahead of us. Today, we're going to start an important conversation, perhaps what we believe is maybe the quintessential question ahead in the development of the next Regional Transportation Plan. And that ultimately is, what are the elements of a regional transit system and ultimately the role of the region in funding that system? We provided and prepared and provided a transit funding policy paper that was included in your agenda packet today that provides some context and options moving forward. And we'll present some of the highlights for you today. But ultimately, what is underscored is the need for us to develop that plan and answer some of these questions so that the plan itself, providing certainty for you to have conversations with our legislature, ultimately before enabling legislation. So with that, next slide. A little bit of an overview of the topics we'll cover today, provide a little history of the region's transit funding today. Also, the important and perhaps really unique role of local funding in transit in this region. We'll talk about some of our policy options moving forward as it relates to transit, give you an update as well on our conversations with the management committee work group a few weeks ago, and then talk again about those big questions ahead. Next slide. Joining me today as part of this presentation is MAG's Transportation Economic and Finance Program Manager, John Bullen. I'd be happy to now introduce my colleague to present the next slides.
Thank you, Audra, Madam Chair, members of the TPC. Happy to be here with you today. So as Audra mentioned, I'll first talk a little bit about the current state of transit funding policy in the region, and then discuss really one of the critical elements as we think about transit, which is the role of local funding. So as we've noted previously in this committee, the 2003 RTP that was approved by the MAG Regional Council really served as the basis for the Proposition 400 ballot initiative. It was actually as part of the planning process to develop that RTP that MAG policymakers made the decision to allocate 33.3% of the total half-cent sales tax collections to transit. And so the portion that's allocated to transit is known as the Public Transportation Fund, or PTF for short. Also, as part of those discussions in the 2003 RTP, a portion of the MAG FTA federal funding was allocated to transit, as well as a portion of MAG FHWA CMAQ funding. The transit component of the Proposition 400 program is managed by Valley Metro, and the financial management tool to do so is the Transit Lifecycle Program. Next slide, please. So the chart that you see on the screen represents the allocation of the half-cent sales tax, the portion that went to transit. So basically the breakout of the 33.3% that was allocated to transit. About 45% of that went to fund the rail program, with the balance going to the bus program, and specifically about 7% of total half-cent collections went to fund ADA, with the remaining balance going to fund bus operations, as well as the bus capital that really supports operations. So think about bus purchases, operations and maintenance facilities, and park and ride facilities. Next slide, please. So the development of the 2003 RTP, really the underlying philosophy behind the transit portion was the concept of a plan-based approach. So as part of those efforts, a key number of regional routes were identified, termed as Supergrid Routes. And within that, what we saw prior to Proposition 400 was that there was a lot of variability in transit service across the valley. So that between jurisdictions, we saw differences in the span of service, how late service actually operated, whether or not it operated on the weekends, and then frequency. Did service run every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, every hour? And so really the intent by policymakers back in 2003 was to provide a standardized level of service for these key regional routes, termed as Supergrid Routes. Next slide, please. And then as part of that plan-based approach, there was also a phasing construct that was developed. So not all the regional routes would come on at the same time. There would be a phased approach whereby some routes would begin right when Proposition 400 was initiated in 2006. Other routes weren't supposed to come online until phase 4 of the plan, which is fiscal years 21 through 26. Next slide, please. As part of the bus element, there were also express bus routes that were identified. Similar to the Supergrid route concept, there was phasing associated with this, whereby some routes initiated immediately upon the initiation of Proposition 400, and then some routes weren't identified for service until later in the plan. Next slide, please. So the transit program operated under this plan-based approach for the first several years of Proposition 400 program, and then came the Great Recession. And so as part of that, the transit program in particular faced a lot of challenges. When you consider that only the sales tax funding can support transit operations relative to the arterial and freeway programs where you have federal funding that provides some stability. So as a result, the transit program really was looking at a 40% decrease in regional funding for bus operations. So at the time, the Valley Metro Board made the decision to abandon the plan-based approach and migrate over to a funding-based approach. And so that's the approach that we see today. Next slide, please. So the challenge, of course, is that the world today looks a whole lot differently than it did back in 2003, or really even 2009, 2010, when the policy switch was made. And so as we think about what sort of transit plan we want for the future, it's important to take this into consideration. Next slide, please. Before we go any further, I did want to provide some context. This is a question that we get asked frequently. Our partners down the street get asked this frequently. And that is, how was the 2003 RTP developed? So one of the stated goals in the 2003 RTP was to provide geographic balance of investments across all modes. So there wasn't an agency by agency specific allocation, but rather a total comprehensive. So by and large, the West Valley saw more investments in the freeway program compared to the East Side, which saw more investments in the arterial and street programs. Next slide, please. So next, we'll discuss the role of local funding. Next slide, please. So what you see on the screen is a timeline of the local sales taxes that were passed by all the communities. There's a number of communities that have local sales taxes, and some or all of these local sales taxes are allocated to transit. Next slide, please. So the chart on the screen, what you see is the funding composition of transit. I want to specifically draw your attention to fiscal year 2019. And what you see there is that the vast majority of investments in 2019 were actually funded through local resources. So if you look at total operations costs in 2019, almost 70% of those were funded through local resources. Less than 30% actually came through regional sources. Next slide, please. This point is probably better illustrated by the map on the screen, which I think really tells an interesting picture. And so what you see is all of the local bus routes that were in service in 2019. There were 60 total routes, and of those 60 routes, only 6 were entirely funded by the region. There were an additional 23 routes that were partially funded by the region and partially funded by local municipalities. And then the majority, 31 of that 60, were entirely funded by local agencies. Next slide, please. We see a similar story when it comes to express routes. So of the 21 total routes, 13 were funded entirely by the region. 2 were partially funded by the region and partially funded through local sources. And then the remaining 6, the rapid routes, were funded locally by the city of Phoenix. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? So really the decision that we have in front of us today is, what does the transit program look like in the extension of Proposition 400? Next slide, please. And really one of the big challenges that we have today that policymakers did not face back in 2003 is that as part of the Proposition 400 program, we have funding committed to ongoing operations. So what we did is we looked at the last full year, fiscal year in the transit lifecycle program, and we totaled up total regional resources going to ongoing operations. And so that total in current year dollars is $104 million. That represents almost 20% of total Proposition 400 sales tax collections in 2025. So as we think about devising our system moving forward, keep into consideration almost 20% of our total Proposition 400 sales tax collections have been committed to ongoing operation services. I think the manager's work group summarized this point nicely when it was articulated that, as part of Proposition 400, everything was new. One of the realities that we're facing with the extension of Proposition 400 is that we have some ongoing commitments. So not everything's going to be new. We're going to be looking to the voters to continue what's already in place today. Next slide, please. So really we see 3 different potential paths forward, or perhaps a combination of the 3. We could return to a long-range plan-based approach. This is the original Proposition 400 model. Audra Kester-Thomas will speak a little bit about some of the potential benefits of that, as well as drawbacks. On the other hand, we could stick with what the current policy is today, which is a fixed allocation approach. And last, what we wanted to discuss a little bit more today is something that would be new to the Valley, but certainly not new nationwide, which would be migrate to more of a formula-based approach where we could incentivize transit performance. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Ms. Kester-Thomas.
Thanks again, John. Next slide. So what are the elements of that performance-based approach that we see in other regions? There's a couple very key and notable consistencies across those policies. A formula-based approach is based on data that is updated, analyzed, and used annually to make those allocations that positively correlate with service productivity so that regional benefit for scarce resources is placed and ensured, and ultimately done in a really transparent fashion so everyone knows what to expect. Next slide. As John had indicated, there are certainly some advantages and disadvantages to each of these models. Returning to the long-range approach that was taken in Proposition 400 certainly would allow us to establish some clear regionally focused intent, but the disadvantage is that bus service in particular is highly volatile to changes in market and demand. And we know that in this region, doing service changes for our bus service network every 6 months. So it's hard to be able to map out and identify what demand might be in 25 years from today, and we may not necessarily hit the mark. We could continue with a revenue-based allocation, which certainly would be a consistency of the existing policy, but it has some drawbacks. It does not necessarily promote regionally focused service or incentivize it. Fixed rates over time do not respond to changes in demographic, population, or market changes. And it brings its own questions of equity, especially when applied at a regional level. Alternatively, we can move to a performance-based approach where we're identifying our scarce resources towards regionally focused service that's adaptive to change, market, and or innovation, and is consistent, with our peers' application of operating assistance. The limitation certainly is acknowledged that this would be a change and would take perhaps several years of layering in a phased approach for such a system. As John indicated, I think we're open to feedback on which one or perhaps a combination of these could be forwarded in the future. Next slide. So we did present the same information, perhaps in a little bit more detail with the Management Committee Work Group a few weeks ago, and certainly want to provide some of their reflections to you today. Next slide. I think we heard loud and clear that there was an interest in continuing continuing the regionally funded service that exists today. That map that John showed you about the full and partially funded transit service that will occur in 2025. Large interest in ensuring that baseline continues moving forward. I think there was an acknowledgement that unless or if funding support for transit was held constant, the only way to increase its quality or span and reach would be if it was locally funded. In other words, a critical question ahead is, what is the mix and proportionality of transit funding in the future? There was much discussion about a recognition about the promise to voters. Proposition 400 certainly had those maps associated with them, and in part due to the Great Recession, we weren't able to implement that service. And the pivot ultimately to a revenue sharing model is confusing and complicated and difficult to explain to voters. And ultimately, there's a recognition that whatever decision we make, it will need to be clear and be able to be conveyed effectively to voters who will be relying on to support this initiative. Finally, I think there was interest in further exploring what a formula and performance-based concept might look like applied here in this region, and we endeavor to provide that information accordingly. Next slide. So next steps, next slide. I'll conclude with the two basic questions that we started with today, which is, we're going to need your direction. We need our policymakers' thoughts and direction on these two core questions, which are, what are the core elements of a regional transit system, and ultimately, what is the role of the region in funding that regional transit system? We've talked a lot today about bus operations in particular. And so what's the region's path forward on supporting regional transit into the next extension? What alternatively is the local community's responsibilities for transit in this region? And ultimately, what's the information you need from us to help enable those policy questions? Eric, I'll turn it over to you before turning it over to Madam Chairwoman to provide some feedback. We're interested in getting your thoughts about the information presented today. But Eric, perhaps you have a few words you'd like to share.
Yeah, thank you, Audra. I think these two questions are really key to moving forward. And, you know, as we've talked to elected officials, our managers across the region, it's clear to me that there isn't a common understanding about what's included in a regional transit system. And perhaps more important is the question on the table is, what's the region's role in funding public transportation? Our public transportation system here in the Valley is structured much differently than any other transit system around the country, certainly much different than our peers. And so we really have to be a little creative in terms of how we implement service here. But, you know, as we talk to certainly the call for projects that we received, many transit-related items, everything from microtransit to expanded rail service, commuter rail, as well as light rail. But the question that's still on the table is, what's the role of the region in funding all this? As John presented in his part of the presentation, the Supergrid routes that we currently have running in the Valley, there's 61 routes or 60 routes, and only 6 of those are regionally funded in total. And 23 are funded through a combination of local funding and regional funding. But the bottom line, as John had on that chart, 70% of the bus operations is funded from local resources. And so we have the chart showing, you know, which communities have dedicated taxes for public transportation. Tempe was one of the first, certainly Phoenix, Glendale, and a couple others, but not everybody has that. And so it really has created this uneven playing field, if you will, across the region in terms of the amount of money available for transit. So, Madam Chairman, I think this, in my mind, something that we really need to have some policy guidance on what the role of the region is in funding public transportation, and we need to make sure everybody's on that same page. Thank you.
Thank you. TPC member comments or questions?
Mayor Gago, this is Kevin Hartke from Chandler.
Go ahead, Mayor Hartke.
Hey, thank you all for the presentation. And I'm looking at these two questions and what are the core elements of a regional transportation system? And obviously I look at how are we moving people today, but over a span of several decades, what's the looking forward portion of how will we be moving people in the future? And so to me, it takes all of those elements. We have communities to our east, for example, Gilbert, that either are going to be going through Mesa and being in cooperation with Mesa or Chandler, and the same with us being in cooperation with Phoenix and our surrounding to provide a transportation that our residents and all others can live, work, and play effectively around this valley. So to me, it's today and tomorrow's moving people around the valley. And the second, I know we're all looking at this. I know Chandler, we don't have a dedicated tax, but I would rack it up, we would have a significant tax if I look at just the amount of dollars that are given out of our general fund towards that. And as I look at looking ahead at the prop extension, if it's 20, 25 years, I mean, we would be at a half cent, about $1 billion that will be going into a regional transportation system. So obviously every city is donating into this individually and corporately. And It's just how do we make the mix? I'm a big agreeer that when we go to the folks for voters, we need to keep this as simple as possible. And I really would need to know more about just the formula that we're talking about and how is that formula made up before I'd be willing to throw behind a formula-based approach, and what are the contributions of cities and how do we flex if Gilbert has a higher priority on a bus line that Chandler wouldn't, or how do those things work together? So I think there's a lot more conversation to be had, and thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Harkey.
Madam Chair, this is Mayor Giles. I have a comment.
Please, Mayor Giles.
Thank you. In some ways, it's clear that this conversation is happening too late. We should have, kind of figured out how we feel about this, sooner than later. But oddly, I'm going to suggest that we're having this conversation exactly 2 weeks too early, because I think the reality of our situation is we don't get to choose what goes on the ballot. That's going to be dictated to us by the legislature and by the County Board of Supervisors. So Supervisor Sellers' comments, I think, will be particularly significant today. And then ultimately by the governor as far as signing, what gets put on the ballot. So, and let me preface this by saying I'm a Republican and I endorse Republican candidates and I raise money for Republican candidates. But the reality is that if the legislature after this election in 2 weeks is continued to be controlled by the Republican Party, my Republican colleague legislators don't support expanding transit, particularly rail. And so I appreciate the optimism that was expressed at the beginning of this meeting by saying, hey, let's not give up on asking for something more than a half cent. But I don't think that's realistic if the current political power, stays in place, 2 weeks from now. So this is a critical question, but I think we're not going to know the answer for a couple of weeks. So I think we need to reconvene. And I know we're meeting a week from now in regional council, but again, I think that's going to be an equally irrelevant conversation until we see what the reality of the political landscape is and who gets to choose. It'd be great if the legislature didn't treat Maricopa County differently than the other counties, and we got to pick our own language to go on the ballot. That's ideal. But again, that a Republican-controlled legislature is not going to let us do that. I say with regret. So this has been a great presentation. I think I appreciate the conversation, but again, I'm going to suggest that I think this is really better addressed after we know the political lay of the land.
Madam Chair, if I could just weigh in a little bit. One of the things that my experience on Prop 400, and obviously the legislature's changed, although it was Republican controlled. Andy Biggs was chair of the House Transportation Committee at the time. We worked closely with Andy on the bill. The legislature did not dictate what was on the ballot in Prop 400. That was a MAG decision. And in fact, we were instructed when we started our process not to include rail at the time, and we did. And that's because it was very important for this region and demonstrated by public opinion surveys in particular that was actually something that was needed in the region, and it went through. And so I want to make sure that the policymakers in this region aren't deferring to the legislature. Obviously, we have to deal with the legislature, no doubt about it, know the sensitivity. But I will tell you, and I've said this statement before, and I will stand behind it, that if we are at a half cent and we cannot go higher than a half cent, as the other 14 counties in Arizona can, and Mayor Giles, you're right, we're treated differently in Maricopa County, even though we have 35 years of history in terms of taking care of the taxpayer dollars here and actually delivering major transportation investments. We have to continue to do the right thing relative to transportation, and we have to make sure that we don't delegate that authority to others. MAG is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the region, and the legislature does not have the authority to do transportation planning in this region. We are a non-attainment area for air quality. Our regional council cannot approve any plan, program, or project that has not undergone air quality conformity analysis. And what that means is the legislature can't take our plan and start taking things in and out of it, because as soon as you remove something from the plan, we have to redo the air quality conformity. And so our plan moves forward as a package. That's the only way we can do it under federal law even. And so once again, we need to have these serious policy discussions. We need to know kind of what the trade-off is. If we're only at a half cent, what is it? What's in the bucket? What can we put on the ballot? And I'll tell you right now, there's not much there. Our conversations with Valley Metro, for example, one thing we haven't really talked about, some of the capital repair and replacement items. Prop 400 funded a lot of bus replacement, but the rail cars will have to be replaced during the next extension. And I think that's a $500 million item alone, something like that. And so those are the kinds of things that we really have to be serious about to make sure we maintain a good state of good repair on all of our systems, whether that's highways, roads, or transit. So we have a lot of challenges ahead. And once again, I've been pretty consistent saying we have to understand what those trade-offs are. If we're limited to a half cent, 3/4 cent, whatever that level is, what's in that package, and what do we leave on the table in those different funding scenarios. So thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could follow up.
Please, Mayor Giles.
Eric, I pray that I'm wrong about who gets to choose on what goes on the ballot. That'd be great if the region gets to choose that. My impression was that the legislature was going to decide that, and then they would probably defer to the county board of supervisors, and that ultimately a Republican governor, a Republican board of supervisors, and a Republican legislature was going to dictate to us what we could put on the ballot. I agree that we get to make our own plan. But that's like my kids can drop a big Christmas, ask for list, but Santa Claus doesn't necessarily get everything on the list. So maybe we ought to just go back to 101 and have somebody tell us who gets to decide what the Prop 400 extension looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the bottom line is, under Prop 400, that was the Transportation Policy Committee. This committee was the decider in conjunction with the regional council. That's how it happened. And so once again, was it easy? No, it's not certainly a slam dunk. We have to make sure that we kind of touch all the bases, and we make sure that the ninth floor understands what we're doing, and key members of the legislature understand what we're doing too. And we've had those discussions too. So once again, we're all in this together. I think the stakes are too high. If we start dividing up, I think that it's going to be divide and conquer. And I really don't think that's a good thing for the region.
Yeah, this is Jack.
Go ahead, supervisors.
Yeah. And in my opinion, the most important thing that we need to communicate right now is that Maricopa County needs to have the same authority the other counties have. Whether we decide to go to a full cent or 3/4 cent or a half cent is up to us in Maricopa County. It should not be up to the legislature. We need to have that authority, and then we put the plan together that represents what our voters want. We're 62% of the state. We need to have our own say in this, and if we don't, then shame on us.
Again, Madam Chair, I apologize for speaking so much, but I agree with Eric and with my friend Jack. That's the way it should be. I'm just trying to remind people we're stuck with the way that it is. Okay, and the way that it is, I think, is that we can come up with a very ambitious program, but we don't get to go to the voters and say, please give us a cent or 3/4 cent if the unless something changes. And so that's why I'm saying I think this won't be a relevant conversation until we know what the lay of the land is in a couple of weeks from now. The incoming chair of the Senate Transportation Committee reached out to me. I really appreciated it a month or two ago. And the message that he was giving to me is, hey, I'm great at getting votes in the Senate, but you guys are smoking something if you think that we're going to do more than 0.5 cent. So at that point, the conversation became, well, we'd like ADOT to take on the responsibility that they need to have for maintenance. We also need to talk about increasing the gas tax. So, I mean, we talk about other ways to, peel things off out of 400 or the extension of 400 so that we can get more mileage out of it, no pun intended, but shift things back to where they ought to be funded from. So I think that's a strategy we need to talk about. If the legislature continues to have the makeup that it has now, 2 weeks from now, we talk about how do you get more out of 0.5 cent than we're currently getting. But again, I would be delighted to be wrong, but I'm still working under this assumption that unless something changes politically, we've got to figure out how to make 0.5 cent work.
Well, I think Supervisor Sellers has a good message that the TPC should be united in sending, which is that we are the body that comes up with the regional transportation plan, that this group or our predecessors were the one who came up with 400 extension, and that this is the meeting where the plan comes up. It is not a plan that the legislature develops, and that we should have the same, as Mayor Giles said, ability as every other county to make our own decisions. But if we can all be consistent that we are the group that are going to be making the tough decisions, that will go a long way. I had a good conversation with Senator Livingston as well, and I shared with him some of our data from Phoenix and our election where the light rail was on the ballot and it was the only item. In our most conservative precincts in Phoenix, voters supported the light rail. In precincts that right now are covered with elect Trump signs, voters did support the light rail. And so I do think that was new information to him and perhaps also helpful. I think we have far more partners than we did before because we have actual results. And so we should work to tell other levels of government that statute says we are the ones who comes up, federal law says we're the ones who come up with the plan. And we're going to have some hard meetings in this group, but we're up for it. And we can make these hard decisions right here, regardless of who wins. So I think even if it's an incredibly conservative legislature, we should still say the people of Maricopa County should determine Maricopa County's transportation plan, which I think is consistent with conservative values.
I'll just say that I agree with that. I think it is our duty to be optimistic and to make the plan that we need, and then to go to the legislature and to lobby for that. I'm just fighting my pessimistic nature, to think that we're going to be successful at that. And I'll be more. I'm looking forward to a couple of weeks from now coming with a more realistic expectation for maybe what the right strategy is going to be. If we need to, like I say, start lobbying to get ADOT to take on more of their responsibility, get the legislature to say, hey, we can't have this permanent fixed gas tax that doesn't recognize that there's any growth going on in our county and in our state. I mean, I think we might have to think of other strategies to get what we want, depending on the political realities of things.
Well, I think we will turn to our business community members as well to help us with that and make a good business argument that we need to fund infrastructure at the county level, but that the state also needs to step up and make key investments. We are such a quickly growing state, and Mayor Wires alluded to the gas tax earlier, but that if we are going to maintain or improve quality of our transportation system here, we're all going to have to keep investing. And my sense is the business community is strongly with us, and they have seen the prosperity and improved quality of life that has come from previous efforts, and will want to support us in continuing to make those investments.
Mayor, this is Georgia Lord.
Go ahead, Mayor Lord.
Well, I think I like what I'm hearing from Mayor Giles and from you. I think it's time. We've got a problem here in Arizona. We have huge growth all over the city. It's not going to go away. With all the weather patterns throughout the United States, it's bringing us more people. We're bringing more industry. And we keep kicking the can down because everybody's afraid to ask for a little bit more money to build something that's going to improve their lives. It's a quality of life. They're going to be safer on the roads. They're going to get to work on time. I mean, there's so many things that are just practical that influence families. But it's the way you say it. It's the way you sell it. And if you don't absolutely give them what's in it for me, we have to tell them what's in it for them. Individual families, businesses, where we're going, why we're going. Take the politics out. I agree with you, Major Giles. Just get it out of there. This is not political. This is a way of life. So why don't we make a real strong push for quality of life? Wouldn't it be different that we said to our citizens, you know what? We're not doing this for the Republican Party. We're not doing this for the Democratic Party. We're doing it for you, the people that have to go to work every day, have to take your children places, that work so hard to make a living. Let's improve it. Thank you.
I'm feeling charged up now.
I'll give an amen to her. It sounds like a good preaching going on there, Georgia.
All right, so we're definitely sending Mayor Lord down to the legislature to set the tone.
You know, I apologize. I think I may have derailed the conversation a little bit because Audra asked some great questions. And the question is, you know, going forward, frankly, the reality is that a lot of this funding is regional and a lot of it's local. And, you know, there've been great, you know, City of Phoenix has really stepped up, you know, to tax themselves to create a wonderful transit plan. And that's that's what they had to do, you know, given the political realities that, again, that I keep harping on. So I think we need to, again, realize that, hey, if the cities on the west side, you know, want to have a transit plan, you know, you're going to have to smell the coffee and come to the realization that you might have to go to your voters and ask for, you know, a 50-cent sales tax in a West Valley city to accomplish that. You know, I think that's just the reality that we've all functioned under for the last several years in Maricopa County.
And maybe to go back to some of the original questions and policy direction, from my perspective, I see great value in the people who depend on the system to get to work today, still will need to get to work. But I do want to learn more about performance-based systems because we want to serve as many people as possible and really help as many people get to work, to medical appointments, to school, whatever it is. And so that is attractive to me as well. And I don't know if you could speak about that. And is there a way to mesh the two and do a hybrid perhaps?
Mayor Gallego, members of Transportation Policy Committee, we're thrilled to witness and listen to your astute commentary and appreciate the deliberate dialogue. You know, I think we're going to go back and start to look at how this might be applied. You know, certainly it's standard practice across the country. So we have certainly many models to choose from. Indeed, Chairwoman Gallego, I think we've heard that there is a interest in continuing the regionally supported service already. I will remind you, as John did, that that's already a baseline of 20% of the sales tax moving forward. But I think there might be an approach that we can layer in a couple of these concepts. And so it's incumbent upon us. We're going to go back and do some work and bring some strategies for your consideration. So it's easy to understand perhaps how this might look and be applied. Again, it's important to realize that there are, I think, a lot of options, and I'm looking forward to bringing some of those for your consideration. I think we do have some tough choices ahead, but nothing that we can't ultimately deliberate constructively on. So we'll be providing that information in the upcoming months to consider, especially as it relates to a transition or a layering on of approach, if you will.
Thank you. Any additional requests for information, thoughts, comments? Winning lottery ticket numbers so we can have even more money? All right. Well, this item is on for information and discussion only, so we do not need to take a vote today. Seeing no further comments, we will move on in the agenda. We do not have a legislative update today, so we will move on to item number 7, requests for an item on the future agenda. I know we have some pending requests we haven't gotten to yet, but any additional ones? All right. Any announcements from the membership? Wonderful. Well, best wishes for everyone for a safe election day and successful, and business is now concluded. Our meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.